What is the imaginary unit I? Well, it comes from our set of complex numbers, and if we look on the screen right here, we have a sort of a Venn diagram or a chart of our complex number system. So probably up to this point, you've been working with real numbers, and you know the fact that we have rational and irrational numbers, and then with under rational numbers, we have integers, whole numbers, and natural numbers. Well, we also have a subset of numbers that are called imaginary numbers. And with imaginary, we use this lowercase I, and we say that the imaginary unit is equal to the square root of -1. And so what this does is it helps us to be able to take the square root of negative numbers. Because up to this point, we have just said there is no real solution, which is true, but we could find the imaginary solution. So if we say that I is equal to the square root of -1, inverse operation says if we square both sides, then we could say I squared is equal to -1. And so we can use that to help us simplify some negative radicals. And this can be used to write the square root of any negative number. And so what we're going to do in this video is look at how to find the square root of a negative number. So we're kind of looking at two things, right? What is the imaginary unit I? Well, we said it's equal to the square root of -1, or I squared is equal to -1. And then also, how do we now use that information to find the square root of a negative number? So kind of two properties that we need to think about. If x is a positive real number, then the square root of -x is equal to I times the square root of x. And so kind of an example here, if we had the square root of -7, well, we could write that as the square root of 7 times the square root of -1, right? Once we do that, we have square root of 7, we can't simplify that. And square root of -1 we know is I. So that way we could write it as I times the square root of 7. Property number 2, if we now take that and kind of go inverse, if we square that, we're going to have I times the square root of x. If we square that, that's going to give us -x, right? So if we think back to our example with 7, if we have I times the square root of 7, then basically what we're doing is we are distributing this exponent of a 2, right? So I squared times square root of 7 squared. And so I squared we said is -1, and times 7 would be -7. So what we're going to do in these 4 examples here is we're going to kind of break these apart, and we're trying to get the square root of -1. And if we can do that, then we can write that as I. All right, so if we look at our first example, the square root of -81, well, we know that 81 is a perfect square, right? So let's just write this as the square root of 81 times the square root of -1. Well, we know the square root of 81 is 9, and we just learned that the square root of -1 is our imaginary unit I. So the square root of -81 would be 9I. Number 2, we have the square root of -56. So 56 we could think about, does it have any perfect square factors? And it does, 4. So we could write this as the square root of 4, and then 4 times 14 would be 56, so the square root of 14, and then times the square root of -1. So the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of -1 is I, and then we have our square root of 14 that we can't simplify any further. Number 3, we have -7 root -12. So same kind of thing, let's break this apart. -7 times, and 4 would also be a perfect square factor here. So times the square root of 4, times the square root of 3, times the square root of -1. So now we have -7, this would be, square root of 4 would be 2. And we have the square root of -1 would be I, and then we have the square root of -3. So now we can just combine those. So this is going to be -14I, and then we have root 3, okay? So -7 times 2, -14, -14I, and then times root 3. And our last example, number 4, this negative out at the front is basically like having -1, right? So -1 times, we know that 36 is a perfect square, so we can leave it like that. -1 times 6, and then this would be I. So -1 times 6 is just -6, and we can simplify this to -6I. Okay, and so that is what the imaginary unit I is, and how we can use that to find the square root of a negative number.